Part 1, The Island That Shouldn't Be. Why is Singapore so rich? The boy asked, wiping Kea from the edge of his toast. The coffee shop fan ticked slowly overhead, moving the humid morning air around like a spoon in a pot. Outside, buses hissed and swallows stitched quick arcs through the light. We were 2 tables in from the street, just far enough from the sun to think straight. It's a fair question, I said. Because if you start with a map, you'd swear Singapore shouldn't be rich at all. He tilted his head. It's tiny. No forest to fell without cutting into your own house. No diamonds. Not even enough hills to pretend at mountains. In 1965, when it became fully independent, it didn't even have enough water of its own. Yet here it is, the glass towers switching on like a computer booting, the port a choreography of cranes, the airport a clock that never loses a second. Then how? Begin at the waterline, I said. Begin with the currents. If you drew a finger along the map from India to China, you'd trace one of the oldest highways on Earth, the sea lanes that squeeze through the Strait of Malacca and then split and shoal through the narrow throat of the Singapore Strait. Long before anyone called it Singapore, ships were taking shelter in these channels. Merchant captains have always loved 2 things: routes that are shorter than the land empires can march, and havens where the wind may change its mind without drowning you for it. This island offered both, a stopping place in the middle of everywhere. In 1819, a British civil servant named Stamford Raffles sailed into these waters with a problem in his pocket. The British needed a foothold between their interests in India and the crowded treaty ports of China, somewhere the Dutch couldn't choke off. Raffles was not a king nor a warrior, but he understood the currency of attention. He declared Singapore a free port. No import duties, no tariffs, bring your goods, bring your ships, bring your risk, and leave with profit if you can make it. That single rule was like lighting a beacon in a fog. The island began to populate itself: Malay, Chinese, Indian, Arab, Armenian, European, men who thought in ledgers and men who thought in wind. A trading post became a habit. A habit became a port. Okay, the boy said. So it's location. It doesn't make you modern. Plenty of crossroads stay poor. The real story is what the island did with luck once the bill arrived. The bill came many times. The Japanese occupation in the 1940s, when the island learned how quickly the gears of empire can grind to a halt under a different flag. The long years after that, when decolonization was a river running downhill and everyone had to learn to swim. There were unions, strikes, arguments about the future in more languages than most countries teach in schools. For a while, Singapore tried being married to Malaysia. It ended in a separation that felt in the photographs from August 1965 like a sigh and a steel cable snapping at once. Now imagine the island then. Half a city of slums, rows of zinc roofs sweating in the equatorial heat. A working-age population too large for the jobs that existed. Ethnic riots still a recent memory, the army and the police force barely more than uniforms. The British bases providing the oxygen of payroll and procurement, but packing to leave. The ports buzzing, yes, but the value of simply moving other people's goods is thin if you cannot also make things, fix things, design things, decide things. Sounds bad, the boy said. It sounded impossible, I said. Which is the right pitch to tune your will. Here's one way to frame what happened next. Not as destiny, not as inevitability, as a sequence of decisions that could have gone otherwise. Because cities are the sum of their choices, and the island would grow into the shape of its answers. First, open or close. The world in the late 1960s was full of young nations locking their customs houses and trying to grow behind protective walls. Singapore did the opposite. It doubled down on being a node. If you wanted to sell to Asia, you were welcome. If you wanted to sell from Asia, You were welcome. If you wanted to come here and build for the rest of the world, you were welcome, provided you played by rules that would be written with a lawyer's pen and a clockmaker's sense of time. Second, clean or corrupt. Many ports run on favors. Greece can speed things up, but it also makes it hard to climb. Singapore made a public vow to scrub the gears. It wasn't a sentimental vow, it was a business model. If you were a company choosing where to put a factory or a regional headquarters, predictability is priceless. The island decided that the easiest way to sell predictability was to actually be predictable. The civil service would be boring on purpose. The laws would be enforced. The trash would get picked up. The bribes would not be tolerated, not because people become angels overnight, but because the system decided not to feed what it wanted to starve. Third, shelter or scaffold. The government could have tried to cradle every infant industry with subsidies and walls. Instead, it treated the state like a set of scaffolds. Build the platforms people need to climb: education, housing, transport, and then hold firms to performance, not promises. If a company came, the island would train you workers, lay your roads, clear your permits in days, not months. But the island would also expect you to ship, to hire, to export skill as well as goods. Fourth, brains or brawn. The factories that came early were about hands, textiles, simple electronics assembly, ship repair, but the path bent toward brains, engineering, petrochemicals, precision manufacturing, finance, logistics, biomedical science, the art of touching a thing once and making it worth more than if you had touched it twice. These choices didn't live on paper. They lived in the people who worked them until they became habits. A small place cannot be good at everything, so it tried to be excellent at the things that multiplied excellence. If you've ever watched the port at night, the cranes moving like chess pieces and the containers stacking into temporary cities, you've seen a machine built not just of steel, but of scheduling, of software before the word had glamour. If you've ever walked through the airport and felt the way a traveler's confusion is anticipated and softened, you've felt a philosophy: make friction your enemy and people your bet. But how do you start? The boy asked. If you're poor, how do you afford to be clean and fast and smart? You sequence, I said. You stack the dominoes. The answer was certainty, so they designed certainty. 1. Stop clearances. Industrial estates with power and water ready, a port that turned ships around with ruthless efficiency, a police force and courts that made contracts feel less like dreams. If you were a company in Detroit or Dusseldorf or Tokyo, the message was: bring your machines, we will bring the people. Bringing the people meant schools. Not poetry first, though the city would later learn to love that too, but arithmetic and English and the kind of science you can put on a factory floor, bilingualism for the citizens, so the island could talk in the global market's lingua franca and still be itself at home. Technical institutes sprouted, polytechnics grew, universities learned to measure themselves against places with centuries of head starts. It also meant roofs. When you cannot trust the ground beneath your feet, you cannot plan for anything except escape. The island built housing not as charity but as infrastructure, the way you build a bridge because the river exists. Blocks rose, neat and sturdy, around hawker centers that put food, conversation, and a certain democracy of appetite at the feet of apartment towers. Ownership tied people to the island, maintenance kept the blocks from becoming a new kind of slum, urban planning kept the arteries open so that growth would not strangle itself in traffic. These are big moves, the boy said, but they feel cold. They were sometimes cold, I said. They were also survival. And in the spaces between policy, people invented warmth. Hawkers perfecting a broth for decades, aunties comparing fruit as if they were diplomats, which in fact they are. Kids in school uniforms riding the MRT and holding whole futures on their laps, wrapped in plastic, still warm from the copy center. He leaned closer. So that's it? Geography and rules and work? That's why it's rich? That's how it starts, I said. But richness here is also about refusing to be a one-trick port. Many cities that live by ships die by shortcuts. This one tried to treat every advantage as a platform to climb to the next one. The port was a platform for manufacturing. Manufacturing was a platform for skills. Skills were a platform for finance and technology. Each level required more trust, more precision, more patience than the one before. Each level needed the earlier ones to be kept tidy. We paid for breakfast. Outside, the city had arranged itself into a set of practical miracles, rain gutters that could swallow a sudden storm, buses that explained themselves in crisp lights, street trees that worked as shade and hush. You could try to reduce it to slogans, but when you watch it work, you realize it's engineering married to modesty. Let me tell it to you like a fairy tale, I said as we crossed the street. Once upon a time, there was an island that had nothing it could dig from the ground. So it mined the future instead. It mined time by making things happen faster and more reliably than elsewhere. It mined trust by making the cost of doing business the price printed on the receipt, not the bribe tucked under the table. It mined attention by making every encounter, from a customs inspection to a hospital visit, so smooth that people wanted to come back with more to do. And because it mined these things, other treasures arrived by ship and plane, machines, money, and most precious ambition. That's not a fairy tale, he said. It's a plan. Fairy tales survive because they carry plans inside them. I smiled. But plans meet reality. In the next part of this story, we'll walk through the years when those choices were tested, when the factories buzzed, when the first multinationals landed, when housing blocks turned slums into staircases, and when the island began to aim not just for rich, but for resilient. For now, remember this: Singapore didn't become rich by being big. It became rich by being clear. He looked back at the coffee shop, the auntie rinsing cups in quick silver motions, the uncle counting change with the touch of a pianist, and nodded. Part 2, Hard Choices, Fast Results, 1965 to 1979. We took the bus west, past neat rows of flats and fields of cranes, to a place that once smelled of mangrove and mud. The sign said Girong, but half a century earlier it might as well have said, "Are you serious?" Serious enough to drain a swamp, I told the boy as we stepped down. Serious enough to wager the island's future on factories no one had seen yet. In the late 1960s, the island made a set of choices that would be its fingerprints for decades: open when others closed, build when money was tight, make rules that were boring on purpose, and keep score with results rather than speeches. Choice 1, make things for the world, not just for yourself. Many new countries tried to wall off their markets and coax infant industries behind high tariffs. Singapore did the opposite. It told the world's manufacturers, if you want to sell from Asia to everywhere, come here. We will be your launch pad. We will lay your roads before you land and train your workers as you unbox your machines. Jurang was the wager. Skeptics called it folly. But roads were poured, power lines strung, and factories rose like a row of teeth, biting into the future: textiles and garments at first, then ship repair, oil refining, and electronics assembly. The pitch to foreign investors was simple and ruthless: one-stop approvals, reliable utilities, and a port that acted like time was money, because it was. Who came? The boy asked. Enough companies to prove the point, I said. Semiconductor lines began to blink into life. Precision parts arrived. The smell of flux and cutting oil mixed with the heavy breath of refineries. Every crate that landed taught the island a new verb: solder, calibrate, schedule, standardize. Choice 2, swap chaos for cooperation in the workplace. In the years before independence, strikes were frequent and politics spilled onto factory floors. That energy had to be rewired. The new model was a triangle: workers, employers, and the state argue, yes, but around a table with data and deadlines, not street barricades. Unions reorganized. Negotiations shifted from brinkmanship to bargaining with benchmarks. Wages were tied to productivity, and the promise was this: as the pie grows, slices grow too, but no one flips the table. The boy frowned. Isn't that just telling workers to be quiet? It was telling everyone to be responsible, I said, which can sound like scolding until you see pay packets fatten, skills rise, and strikes turn into training sessions. Cooperation wasn't free, it had to be earned. But once it became habit, it multiplied trust. Foreigners saw stability, locals saw progress, and the factory clock kept the beat. Choice 3. Build roofs before dreams. At dawn and dusk, the city still had slums in 1965. Zinc roofs sweating, alleyways that turned to rivers when the rain broke. The island decided that housing was not charity but a platform. New blocks rose fast and square, each one with lifts, drains that worked, and hawker centers that stitched food into community. Keys changed hands in ceremonies that became small festivals. The idea was not just shelter, it was stake. Ownership turned tenants into citizens with skin in the game. Weren't they ugly? He asked, glancing at the plain lines of the older estates as our bus rolled past. But plain beats precarious. Beauty came later: trees, playgrounds, fresh paint, town centers. First, make it livable, then make it lovable. That was the order. Choice 4, teach to the task, then widen the task. Classrooms filled. Chalk dust rose. English was made the working language, not to erase mother tongues, but to add a common tool. Schools emphasized arithmetic and science you could use on a shop floor. Technical institutes sprouted, polytechnics grew, apprenticeships paired theory with shift work. The deal was straightforward. We'll bring the world's machines, you learn to run them better each month than the last. Only math and metal? The boy asked. First, yes, I said, because the quickest ladders were made of circuits and steel. But scaffolds are not ceilings. As factories got better, the schools did too. The aim was never to freeze kids in place. It was to keep building rungs. Choice 5, clean government, clockwork delivery. Corruption makes ports slow, courts fuzzy, and promises expensive. The island decided to starve it. Investigators were empowered, rules were tightened, pay for public servants was set high enough to recruit competence and remove excuses. Permits arrived in days instead of months, not because someone knew a guy, but because the system was designed like a well-run kitchen: tickets in, meals out, no special orders. Sounds cold, he said. Cold like stainless steel, I said, which is the right temperature for an operating theater. You want warmth in the ward, not in the scalpel. Choice 6, defense first, because prosperity loves peace. When the British signaled their withdrawal, the island had to grow a spine overnight. National service put young men in uniform, mixed by race and language, and taught them to move as one. Shipyards that had repaired imperial fleets learned to earn their keep under local flags. Small doesn't mean weak if small is organized. The message to the neighborhood was polite and unmistakable. We will be useful, we will be open, and we will also be hard to swallow. Choice 7, bet on infrastructure that pays for itself by saving time. The port adopted containerization early, turning a chaotic dance of bundles and boxes into an algorithm of standardized steel. Turnaround times shrank, throughput leapt. Air travel was still at an older airfield then, but plans were drawn for a new airport that would treat passengers like they were important customers rather than problems to be processed. Drainage canals were deepened and widened, rainstorms became exercises the city had rehearsed. And water? The boy asked, remembering what I'd said about scarcity. New reservoirs were carved into the island's green, I said. Pipes and agreements ensured the taps ran. It wasn't a final solution, it was a serious plan. The lesson repeated everywhere: if you cannot grow supplies, grow reliability. Then came the test. The 1970s were not a gentle decade. Oil prices spiked. Global growth coughed. Shipping cycles turned like bad weather. If Singapore's strategy was just luck, it would have cracked. Instead, it flexed. Factories tweaked shifts, raised yields, and learned to make more value with the same hands. Refineries hedged with efficiency and scale. Electronics lines cut defects, moved up to slightly more complex products, and began to attract engineers rather than just assemblers. Wage policies adjusted with care. No grand vows, just a steady hand on the throttle, protect jobs where possible, retrain quickly where not, hold the center. What about the people in the compounds who had to move? The boy asked. Some were angry, most were practical, I said. They traded space for certainty, extended families for elevators. The government moved fast and sometimes brusquely, but the blocks didn't become warehouses for the poor. They became launching pads. Schools were downstairs. Buses came on time. A factory was a 10-minute ride away. A clinic was 2 stops down. When you shrink the distance between effort and reward, a city starts to hum. We walked along a fence where a factory's loading bays purred with forklifts. A supervisor checked a clipboard. A line of workers in blue coats laughed at a joke I couldn't hear. What held it all together? He asked. A promise that kept getting kept, I said. Come on time, and the bus will come. Do your paperwork right, and the permit will arrive. Work hard, and you will see the difference in your pay. Pay tax, and you'll see the road laid and the lights stay on. The state asked for discipline. In return, it delivered predictability. Predictability is the fertilizer of investment and the anesthetic of anxiety. He squinted. Wasn't anyone left out? Of course, I said. No plan reaches everyone at once. There were families who struggled, workers whose factories closed before retraining found them, communities that felt their old rhythms erased. But because the basics, water, housing, transport, safety, were made universal rather than aspirational, the floor rose each year. That mattered. Floors changed lives more than ceilings. At the port, a container yard climbed into the sky like a city of bright bricks. Trucks traced patient paths. You could feel the logic, everything labeled, everything placed. If you rolled a marble at the top of this hill, you knew exactly where it would land. That's what the 1970s did, I said. They turned improvisation into procedure and luck into logistics. They made the first million decisions that later decades would take for granted. Give me a picture, the boy said. What does fast results look like? Like this, I said, and gave him scenes. A morning in a new flat, parents unlocking their own front door, a child standing on a stool to reach the sink, still marveling that water flows every time. A factory line at 2 a.m., a supervisor ringing a bell because they've gone a week without a single defective unit, and the accountant smiling because a week like that pays for a new machine. A union hall in the afternoon, workers and management arguing over a wage increase, then agreeing that everyone wins if productivity hits a target that's written on the wall in fat numbers. A port control room, screens showing berths, tides, crane assignments, a ship captain radioing in, surprised at how quickly someone answers with a plan that already fits. A training course in a polytechnic, young adults practicing measurements to microns, then filing their first resumes with confidence that the paper means something outside the classroom. A parade square under a hard sun, new recruits learning to keep time together, then being dismissed to go home on the same trains as the office crowd, uniforms blending into a city that knows why those uniforms exist. Add up enough scenes like that, I said, and a country changes its metabolism. We found shade under a rain tree and watched late shift buses fill with people carrying lunch pails and folded newspapers. The boy said nothing for a while. The city was giving its own lecture. Schedules kept, promises made visible. So, by the end of the 1970s, he said at last, Singapore was what? Safe? Busy? Housed? All of those, I said. And ready. The first act was survival with speed. The second act would be ambition with direction. You can get rich by assembling other people's ideas. You stay rich by designing your own. The next chapter is about climbing without letting go, moving from simple assembly to precision, from subcontracting to strategy, from cheap to worth it. New schools, new skills, new kinds of companies. The rules wouldn't change, the rungs would. He stood, stretching, and looked back at the orderly geometry of Jurang, the roads like lines on graph paper, the smokestacks striped like candy canes, the drains polished by sudden rain. For a place that once was swamp, it radiated intention. Fast results, he said, trying the phrase on his tongue. Fast results anchored to hard choices, I said. That's the trick. Part 3, Climbing the Value Chain, 1980 to 1997. The train doors sighed open and we stepped into a station tiled like a clean idea. A chime, a rush of air, the scent of rain still seeping from people's clothes. The letters on the wall said, Raffles Place. Above us, steel and glass leaned into the sky with the confidence of a solved equation. This wasn't here when your story started, the boy said, craning his neck. None of the important ladders are, I said. You build them when the ground changes. By the 1980s, the island had survived the first act. Factories humming, flats rising, ports and roads doing exactly what they promised. But survival is a platform, not a pinnacle. Wages were climbing, which was good for families and tricky for companies that had chosen Singapore for cheap hands. So the island made a decision that most places talk about and few execute. Stop selling cheapness and start selling skill. How do you flip that switch? He asked. You flip many in sequence, I said, and you wire them to each other so they stay on. First switch, from assembly to precision. In the 1970s, a lot of value arrived boxed and left boxed, with human hands standing between the two. The 1980s introduced a new rhythm. Lines still assembled, but quality targets tightened like violin strings. Factories invested in measurement and metrology, in jig accuracy and process control. Good enough got retired, zero defect moved from a poster to a plan. When you chase microns, you need technicians who speak tolerances as a language. Pay rose for those who could fix the one machine that everyone else watched with fear. A place that once borrowed know-how began to rent it out by the hour. Second switch, from subcontractor to specialist. When multinationals came in the early days, they brought recipes and expected local partners to follow them. By the mid-80s, some of those local partners could tweak the recipe, suggest a redesign to cut waste, adjust a supply chain to cushion shocks, rewrite a maintenance schedule to add an extra hour of uptime. A subcontractor that can improve the plan becomes a specialist. Specialists make themselves hard to replace, not by holding secrets hostage, but by making themselves too useful to lose. Third switch, from cheap capital to smart capital. Money had always flowed through the port. The question of the 1980s was whether money could be persuaded to sit down and work. The island cleaned its financial plumbing, built trust with predictable rules, and taught its bankers to think beyond loans into services, trade finance, risk management, regional headquarters work. A quiet phrase entered daily speech in offices looking down on the river. Is Singapore the place to decide this? The more often the answer was yes, the richer the city became without loading a single crate. We came up into a morning lined with umbrellas. The boy watched them bloom and collapse at crosswalks, a choreography no one had to rehearse. What changed for regular people? He asked. Almost everything, I said, but mostly their sense of time. The new airport out east opened and taught the region what on time could feel like when an entire system conspires to respect your minutes. Flights connected a small city to large worlds. A national airline transformed punctuality and hospitality into a brand that multiplied national self-respect. The container port expanded until maps needed new ink. The first lines of the MRT began to stitch the island together in 1987, Once people trusted the train's promises, they planned days tighter, met friends further, took jobs they'd previously turned down because buses were roulette. Time is money, he said, quoting the oldest cliché in business. In Singapore, time is also dignity, I said. It lets you dare. In the middle of the decade, the island hit its first real recession since independence. Orders fell. A high-wage push had gotten ahead of productivity. Suddenly, the country that sold certainty had to admit a mistake and adjust in public. What did they do? The boy asked. They treated policy like engineering, I said. They backed off wage hikes, trimmed certain compulsory savings rates to keep pay in pockets, cut taxes to boost confidence, and doubled down on training so the pause would be a pivot, not a slump. It wasn't painless, but the lesson stuck. Agility beats pride. Admitting a wrong turn is faster than insisting the road will move for you. When growth returned, the climb was different.
Electronics deepened from assembly to fabrication, chemicals moved from simple refining to complex chains, the city began to whisper new words, wafer, clean room, ISO, that would have sounded like science fiction to the dockworkers in 1965. At the same time, the government looked at its own desks and decided that paper could no longer be the city's bloodstream. Computerization crept through ministries and then leaped. Permits went from clipboards to terminals, data started joining the dots behind the scenes, the public learned that a counter without a queue was not magic but management.
The boy grinned. So going digital wasn't just a vibe. It was a strategy wrapped in service, I said. Every minute saved at a counter is an hour freed somewhere else, at a lab bench, in a workshop, with your kids. Education moved in parallel, because ladders don't climb themselves. Technical schools updated their machine parks, polytechnics grew proud of their links to industry, universities shook off provincial modesty and began hiring and publishing with an eye on the world. English stayed the working language to anchor competitiveness, but mother tongues were insisted upon at home and in school so the island wouldn't become a hotel where you forget your own name. The tension was real, rigor curdled into anxiety in some households, the culture of kiasu, fear of losing out, grew new teeth in the shape of tuition and test prep. But the core worked as intended. A small country became a big classroom for applied ambition. Got a bus inland and watched neighborhoods blur into one another without losing their edges. New towns had matured into small cities of their own, libraries, sports halls, clinics, town centers stacked with practical pleasures. If the first generation's triumph was owning a front door, the second's was choosing what to do after opening it. What about the state companies? The boy asked. You always mention the private firms. The island tried to be pragmatic, I said. Some businesses are better run by the market. Some ports, airports, telecoms of that era are skeletons you don't want to break. So a stable of government-linked firms grew up, not as pet projects, but as utilities and champions, run commercially, judged mercilessly by numbers, and expected to compete abroad, not just collect rents at home. When they worked, they pulled entire supply chains up with them.
Land reclaimed from the sea gave the map new eyebrows, business districts pushing outward, industrial islands that would later host long chains of pipes, waterfronts planned rather than stumbled upon. The green promise, parks, trees, canals trained to take sudden rain, wasn't decoration. In the heat, shade is productivity. In the tropics, drainage is insurance. Engineers did as much gardening as the gardeners did engineering. You always see hairline fractures if you look close, I said. Inequality nudged upward as markets rewarded certain skills. The stress of winning in school and at work could fray households. The culture argued with itself how much to prize tradition, how much to chase the new. Immigrants arrived to do jobs locals preferred to leave behind, and that raised questions about identity and space. But the floor kept rising and the middle widened. The city retained the right to critique itself without losing its appetite to improve. In the early 1990s, something changed in the tone of the skyline. Headquarters signs joined factory logos.
The conversation in lifts shifted from which part to which region. Lawyers, accountants, logisticians, designers, software folks, people whose work was thought rather than torque, filled more floors. The island's pitch to the world had evolved not just we can make it, but we can plan it, finance it, protect it, improve it, and ship it on time. The boy watched two office workers pass us arguing happily about whether to take a red-eye to Tokyo or an early morning flight to Jakarta. The world had been shrunk to distances measured by decent coffee and reliable Wi-Fi. Did the port and airport still matter as much? He asked. More, I said. When your high-value work depends on fragile timelines, a late ship or a missed connection can snap a whole month. Logistics became a nervous system rather than a skeleton. The people who scheduled containers and gates were the same kind of professionals who priced risk and wrote code. It was all one economy, the art of hitting your marks. We took a cab to a cleanroom viewing gallery where visitors could stare through glass at a ballet of bunny-suited technicians. It felt like watching astronauts preparing for a mission that never leaves the ground. The boy pressed his hand to the glass. You can't hide shortcuts in here, he whispered. That's the idea, I said. When you raise the bar for dust, you also raise the bar for everything else. Documentation, training, maintenance, air itself. That discipline leaks out of the factory and into habits. Cities inherit the temper of their work. The 1990s crept toward their close with a tremor rolling in from elsewhere. Currencies wobbled to the north and east. Markets buckled. The phrase Asian financial crisis began hopping through headlines like a small fire that hadn't yet found a wind. So the test was coming, the boy said. Every decade brings its exam, I said. But by then the island had something it hadn't possessed at independence, layers. If electronics slowed, chemicals held. If manufacturing coughed, finance kept breathing. If exports dipped, domestic demand didn't vanish into fear. And this matters, the state had the muscle memory to move quickly without moving wildly. He looked out over a city that, in a single generation, had learned to treat speed as a virtue and stillness as a choice rather than a lack. Lunch crowds eddied around us. Engineers with lanyards, admin staff with tubs of noodles, delivery riders weaving with acrobatic courtesy. A place that once sold ships safe harbor now sold companies safe decisions. Tell me the picture for this chapter, he said, smiling at the game we'd invented. Here it is, I said. A classroom where a teacher explains quality control with a box of biscuits, count the broken ones, calculate the percentage, debate whether the oven or the packing machine needs attention, learn that math can taste like work. A factory whose walls are white not for beauty but because dust has nowhere to hide on white, and an 18-year-old who started on the line now calibrates a machine that costs more than the block he grew up in. An airport where an overnight layover turns into a habit because the place treats people like good customers instead of problems, and a pilot jokes that the coffee here could file a flight plan. A government office where a clerk who used to stamp forms now designs portals that remove the need for a clerk and goes home proud anyway because dignity is not in the stamp but in the service.
A meeting room where a local supplier tells a multinational, politely, that a different alloy will cut failure rates in half, and the multinational nods and writes a new specification with a pen that suddenly belongs to both of them. A living room where parents who grew up in kampongs argue gently about whether their child should study engineering or law, and catch themselves smiling because the argument itself is wealth.
We walked to the river and watched the water take on the color of the sky. A tourist boat murmured past, office towers blinked their late-day eyes awake. Climbing the value chain? The boy said. It sounds like a slogan, but it's a story of habits. Exactly, I said. Habits that make precision a reflex, speed a courtesy, trust a default. In the 1980s and 1990s, Singapore learned how to sell reliability at the price of excellence. That's why it got rich without getting lucky twice. He nodded, as if filing the thought beside the others. And then And the wind shifts, I said.
Currencies shudder.
The dot-com future arrives with a drumbeat and then stumbles. Terror rewrites airport choreography. A city that built for predictability learns to dance with shocks. He looked at the towers one more time, then down at the clean line where pavement met river. Ready, he said, as if to the city and himself at the same time. Part 4, Turbulence and Adaptation, 1997 to 2005. The first gust hit at night. Screens glowed in dealing rooms, numbers unstitched from their moorings, currency skidded as if the floor had turned to oil. Across the region, neon gave way to candlelight in a few unlucky offices. The boy watched the river's surface wrinkle under a wind that seemed to come from far away. The Asian financial crisis, I said, a reminder that even careful cities live on moving water. Vonnesgang. Bankers spoke in clipped sentences, then slower ones. Export orders thinned, property cooled. The island's reflexes were tested in public in real time. What happens when the tide runs out? The boy asked. You lighten the boat, I said, and you keep rowing together. The tripartite triangle of workers, employers, and government shifted from slogans to spreadsheets. Companies trimmed costs without mass abandonments. A variable piece of pay that had been theory in good years became practice in bad ones. Employer contributions to compulsory savings were eased to defend jobs, bonuses shrank, executive pay took a visible haircut. A promise was kept, pain would be shared, and recovery would be shared too. On a weekday morning in Durong, a supervisor who once measured success by headcount learned to measure it by uptime. At a union hall, stewards explained the arithmetic of survival to tired families and were listened to because in better times their math had delivered raises. At a polytechnic, a machinist in his 40s took night classes in quality systems, cheeks flushed with effort and embarrassment in equal measure, then returned to the shop floor with new ways to cut defects. If the tide drops, his instructor said, you learn where the rocks are, then you draw a better map. The storm passed, as storms do. Then another kind of weather rolled in, bright, caffeinated, crackling with prefixes. .com, the boy guessed, grinning. We walked through an office where whiteboards wore brave nouns with E and I stuck to their fronts like decals. Founders pitched ideas that felt like invitations to the party after gravity left town. Venture capital learned the taste of Kopi. Corporates sponsored hackathons before anyone called them that. Some companies built real businesses, others built slogans. Then the music stopped, as it always does when enthusiasm outruns income. Server rooms emptied. Foosball tables went to storage. A different kind of courage appeared, a CEO telling 20 people with good hearts and rent to pay that the runway was gone. What did the island learn? The boy asked. That the future is fantastic, but cash flow is a fact, I said. And that you can be curious without being credulous. The city backed the networked world, but it kept one eye on unit economics and the port ledger. When the bubble lanced, the pipes it left behind broadband, data centers, a taste for code stayed. Good infrastructure keeps paying rent even after bad dreams move out. The next shock was not about money. It rewrote the geometry of confidence. One morning, metal and flight were turned into weapons in a sky far away. Across the world, airports became fortresses and new rituals replaced old ones. Changi did what it always tries to do, absorb a constraint, make it humane, and keep you moving. Security lines lengthened, but choreography improved. Rules multiplied, but clarity kept pace. The island's prosperity depends on planes that arrive full and depart on time. Fear tries to make both impossible. So the airport became a classroom for calm, briefings clear, signage honest, staff trained to help without drama. The city learned that safety is also service. Then came disease, close and breathing, masks on trains, thermal scanners at doorways blinking like rectangular eyes, schools measuring temperatures at gates, a hospital designated as a shield against a virus no one fully understood. Streets that normally bustle at lunch fell quiet. Hawker centers counted empty chairs. Taxi drivers napped in their cars because there was no one to ferry. SARS? The boy asked softly. Yes, I said. A test of trust. Trust that the numbers announced each day were the real numbers. Trust that the lines between quarantine and freedom were drawn for necessity, not convenience. Trust that neighbors who taped a note to your door, "We've left dinner outside," did it out of care, not fear. Healthcare workers wore grooves into their faces where masks bit. For hours, the city sent meals and applause in reply. Contact tracing was organized with a clerk's patience and a detective's thoroughness. The economy slowed because people did the right thing. Then it recovered because people kept doing the right thing. The habit of following rules because they're fair, not because you're frightened, proved itself more valuable than any subsidy. While the island learned to manage risk at borders and in wards, it also learned to wring more resilience from its ground and sky. The old anxiety, water, was met with an engineer's stubbornness. New reservoirs bloomed on the map. A clear, cold liquid with an audacious name found its way into glasses, recycled to a standard higher than superstition, then piped to factories and blended into taps. Desalination plants began to turn the sea itself into a fourth source. If you cannot grow a mountain with snowmelt, you grow a system with membranes that sing at a pitch only pumps can hear. It wasn't just resource policy, it was a cultural statement. We will make scarcity boring. The economy refused to freeze during fear. It re-aimed. The city had decided years earlier that the next rung up included science you could not see with the naked eye. Now the scaffolds rose in steel and glass, a new district of labs and benches where white coats ate the same nasi lemak as their neighbors but spoke of genomes between bites. The island didn't just rent space to research, it hired managers who understood how to pair a young postdoc with an old manufacturing hand and get a therapy, not just a paper. Incentives were written to favor results while reminding the budget that curiosity is expensive and sometimes must be. Did people accept all this change, the boy asked? Or did they feel moved around like pieces? Both, I said. But the city tried to be honest about its bets. When it asked for patience, it showed work. When it asked for sacrifice, it matched it with its own. That's the only way we stays believable. Government itself changed shape without changing its bones. In ministries once ruled by paper, databases began to speak to one another. A single password opened doors that used to require queues. Counters that once stamped forms became places that taught you how not to need a counter. The boredom of bureaucracy remained deliberately. But boredom was redirected from the citizen's wait to the programmer's checklist. If you can do it online, a notice said, please do. People did. The city's skin changed too. A theater on the bay opened like a pair of durians, strange and self-certain, and the island debated whether it looked beautiful. Then it became beloved the way useful things do, by being the place where memory happens. Parks thickened. The idea of a garden city moved from planting trees along roads to planting roads among trees. Not just nice, but necessary. Shade as productivity, walking paths as public health, green as engine, and insurance in a climate that can turn vicious in an afternoon.
Leadership passed from experienced hands to younger ones. The voice at the podium shifted timbre but continued the tune, open, disciplined, pragmatic, ambitious, kinder where it could, iron where it had to be.
The island began to talk more openly about creativity as an input, not a garnish. Civil society explored its range with tentative confidence. Artists argued that beauty trains a city's attention the way science trains its patience. There were fumbles, and some lines were drawn with a ruler rather than a brush, but the canvas widened. Then, a debate that cut across dinner tables: should the island build integrated resorts with casinos? Many flinched, many leaned in.
The case made by the state was disarmingly prosaic. Tourism needed a new spine, conventions and exhibitions would pay rents that factories could not, social safeguards would be real, not performative. The case made by skeptics was human and persistent. The cost of temptation is not easily accounted for in spreadsheets.
In the end, the island decided to take the risk with eyes open and rules thick. It was a signal, after disease and recession, the city would not retreat into caution. It would choose growth again and carry the weight of that choice. "Show me the pictures," the boy said. "What does adaptation look like?" A thermal camera at a hospital door that catches a single raised temperature, and a nurse who politely guides a stranger to a room and maybe saves a dozen families without anyone ever knowing the arithmetic of that kindness. A production line that once measured success by volume, now measuring it by yield, and a worker who used to count boxes, counting defects, and taking pride in the smaller number. A public housing corridor where a neighbor leaves a care package at a quarantined family's door with a note that says, "Eat while it's hot," and no signature, and a child inside who will remember that handwriting as a fact about his country. A lab bench at midday where an engineer and a biologist argue about a sensor while their lunches go cold, and later that year a factory stamps out something that helps a patient in a city neither of them will ever visit. An airport gate where a security officer explains a new rule with a smile, and a traveler obeys not because he must, but because the officer has made the rule feel like part of a shared project rather than a wall. A water tasting where a minister jokes, a scientist doesn't, and the crowd laughs anyway and drinks, all quietly agreeing that dignity also comes in the form of a tap that will still run in 50 years.
By 2005 the island had a new kind of strength, not invulnerability, which is a myth, but recoverability, which is a discipline. It could take a punch without losing its stance, change its footwork without losing the rhythm.
Manufacturing had become smarter. Services had thickened into decision-making, not just paperwork. Science had put down real roots. The airport and port were still clocks you could set your watch by. The taps, literal and figurative, ran. The boy looked at the skyline, older towers trimmed by new ones, scaffolds coming down from buildings that had already entered the city's mental map, as if they'd been there all along. Buses sighed. A child on a scooter traced perfect arcs in a plaza where fountains pretended they were rain. For a moment, everything felt arranged and earned. "So adaptation isn't just bending," he said. "It's binding new parts into the old, so the whole thing holds." "Exactly," I said. "If the first acts built speed and reliability, this one added antibodies. The next will ask whether a rich city can stay generous and inventive while the world rearranges itself again." He pocketed his mask, kept out of habit, and smiled. "On to the next exam. Part 5, Global Shocks, Local Strength, 2005 to 2015, we stood on the promenade at Marina Bay just after rain, where the city had drawn a new outline for itself, water like polished metal, towers reflecting towers until the horizon felt recursive. In the distance, a ship edged along a lane it had known for centuries. Near us, a building shaped like a ship sat across 3 towers that had appeared as if the bay had made a bet and won. "Did they really put a boat on a hotel?" the boy asked. "They put a statement on a skyline," I said. That Singapore would not sit out the world's reinvention, it would host it. The decade began with appetite. Tourism needed a spine, so the island decided to shoulder a risk. Integrated resorts, casinos wrapped in conventions, theaters, hotels, and promises stitched with rules. Entry levies for locals, self-exclusion registers. Watchfulness dressed as hospitality. Bet paid not only in chips and room nights, but in a new calendar. Exhibitions, meetings, shows that turned an airport into a global concourse for decisions. Across the bay, domes rose from gardens that grew science under glass, reminding everyone that in the tropics, design and ecology are the same conversation. Then came the lesson that growth never travels alone. In 2008, Elsewhere's greed and leverage detonated like a depth charge. The splash was far away, the wave wasn't. Credit froze. Trade shuttered. Order books thinned until factories could see the bottom of the month through the paper. A nation that had taught itself to avoid drama faced a kind of drama you can only soften, not stop. "What do you do when the world forgets how to buy?" the boy asked. "You buy time," I said.
The island opened fiscal valves with the speed of a factory resetting its line, wage support that kept workers on rosters, training subsidies that turned slack hours into certificates, tax and cash flow relief to help firms breathe. The public purse acted like a flywheel, storing momentum when markets stalled and releasing it where hands actually worked.
Banks, made boring on purpose, proved to be the kind you want in a storm. Prudential rules had kept balance sheets trim and temptations fenced. Unemployment rose, then fell, exports dipped, then recovered. The habit of acting together, unions, employers, the state, turned a global panic into a local problem with an end date. "And the skyline," he said, glancing at the ship hotel again. "Opened on schedule," I said. "You don't walk away from a bridge when the river is high." The airport kept time like a metronome, adding gates and lounges while low-cost carriers rewrote price expectations. A new terminal joined the older ones and proved that even security could be choreographed into something like courtesy. The train network looped and dived, one line drawing a circle, another reaching downtown like a blue vein. Commutes shortened, choices widened. Money changed moods. Wealth that once hid in numbered accounts elsewhere began looking for jurisdictions that respected privacy without sheltering secrecy.
The island's reply was not a wink but a document, agreements, standards, checks, saying, "We will be clean, we will be strict, we will still be attractive because reliability is a luxury too." Private banking blossomed, but the message from the regulator stayed the same as the one at the port: "You can go fast here, but only in a straight line."
People were getting richer, the boy said. Did everyone feel it? Enough did to keep the peace, not enough did to end the argument, I said.
Housing prices heated, the city threw water with cooling measures that read like a short course in applied incentives, tighter mortgages, stamp duties for speculation, more flats released to bend supply closer to demand. Foreign labor, which had filled holes on construction sites and in service jobs, became a subject at dinner tables. How many is enough? How fast is too fast? Who belongs on a crowded train?
Quotas tightened, levies rose, the country spoke aloud about the shape of growth, and whether more was always smarter than better. Workfare expanded the idea of a wage, adding top-ups for the lowest paid that acknowledged a fact markets often dodge: dignity doesn't trickle, you pipe it. Health insurance widened into something that followed you for life, so an unlucky diagnosis wouldn't cancel decades of thrift. A package for older citizens, those who had built the first version of the city, arrived with more than sentiment in its envelope. The message was simple: gratitude is a budget line. Science and software kept putting down roots. On one hill, glass and steel labs lit up at night like careful lanterns. On another, startups moved into offices that had been designed for experiments rather than corner views. The island didn't aim to be Silicon Valley, it aimed to be Singapore, with more code networks on lampposts, sensors and drains, databases that let buses explain themselves, and doctors compare notes without losing sleep. The phrase "Smart Nation" began to appear not as a boast, but as a to-do list. Fix the slow, connect the silent, make data useful without making people nervous. We crossed a bridge that hadn't existed when the century began. Cyclists coasted past. Office workers posed for photos with a sky they couldn't stop taking personally. "And culture?" the boy asked. "You make it sound like spreadsheets all the time." The island discovered that galleries and theaters weren't a garnish, I said. They were a training ground for attention and empathy. Big shows opened, small shows argued back, festivals taught logistics new tricks, and gave artists better rooms to fail in. A sports hub unfurled like a bright sail, and different kinds of spectacle took their turns on the calendar: football one week, a concert the next, a marathon that taught an equatorial city to wake up earlier than the sun. The city also tested its temper. A riot broke out one night in a neighborhood defined by work and memory, and the island confronted questions about respect, stress, drink, duty, and the geometry of crowded living. The response was firm. Order matters here and procedural. Facts matter too. Rules were tightened where necessary, and the broader conversation about coexistence kept at its slow, essential pace. "Give me the pictures," the boy said, smiling at the ritual. "Here they are," I said. A logistics planner at the port who can look at a spreadsheet and hear the sound of cranes from it moving containers in his head like chess pieces until a timetable fits as if it had always been there waiting. A hotel housekeeper who once cleaned rooms in a mid-market tower and now trains a team in a building where rooms come with infinity pools, her checklist longer but her pay and pride larger too. A small manufacturer who survived 2009 by shifting from making 10,000 cheap things to 1,000 expensive things, discovering that precision is a story you sell as much as a tolerance you hold. A bank compliance officer who tells a client no with a kindness that leaves the client staying anyway because trust pays interest over time. A hawker who raises prices by 20 cents after holding them flat for years and apologizes with a smile that says inflation is an equation we share. A nurse teaching an elderly couple how their new insurance works in words that would make sense to a neighbor in the lift, proof that policy only counts when it speaks human. A coder who writes a script that saves commuters 60 seconds at a turnstile and feels like she's stolen an hour back for the city every 10 days. A gardener adjusting irrigation in a park where the trees are arranged to catch wind and throw shade, and a child learning that cool is something you can design, not just wish for. We stopped where the promenade curved into a view of the river that had once been a working mess. The water carried kayaks now and history. At the far end of the decade, the country paused. Flags appeared in windows. Old photographs surfaced. The man whose shadow had stretched across the first 50 years was born, and people queued for hours to say thank you without needing to say more. It turned out that grief, like prosperity, could be organized without being forced. 50, the boy said, thinking of the years stamped on souvenirs and banners. Old or young for a nation? Both, which is the best age, I said. Old enough to know your habits, young enough to change them. He looked at the bay again, the domes where plants practiced climate futures, the offices where decisions rode elevators, the hotel with its improbable deck that made tourists gasp and locals pretend not to. The sky had moved from pewter to pearl. Out at sea, ships waited like patient punctuation. "So why is it rich?" he asked, not as a challenge now, but as a tally. "Because it keeps turning shocks into structure," I said. "Because it uses discipline to buy room for imagination. Because it treats time as a resource and trust as infrastructure. Because when the world sneezes, it doesn't just reach for a tissue, it writes a manual and upgrades the ventilation." He laughed. "Unromantic?" "Romance is in the results," I said. Part 6, Wealth, Worries, and the Next Bet, 2015 today, morning laid a bright line on the bay. Joggers stitched their loops, office towers checked their reflections and declared them sufficient. Somewhere in the middle distance, construction cranes held yoga poses against the sky. The boy leaned on the railing and watched a dragon boat practice cut the water into disciplined V's. "So this is the part where a rich city stays rich," he said. "This is the part where a rich city decides who it's rich for," I said, "and what the money is supposed to do." The years after the 50th birthday felt like a second adolescence. Confidence in the mirror, questions under the skin. Expectations rose with incomes, arguments sharpened with education, the to-do list lengthened with the skyline. The first drumbeat was familiar but louder: cost of living. The island answered with its trademark instrument, policy as choreography.
Public housing kept evolving, new rules to keep speculation from turning corridors into trading floors, leases and locations tuned so homes could be homes first and assets second. More flats released when demand ran hot, cooling measures when markets ran feverish.
Not a single lever pulled and forgotten, but many adjusted in sequence: mortgage limits, stamp duties, build-to-order rhythms. You could almost hear the click of each gear as it caught the next. "Do people like being managed so closely?" the boy asked. "They like being able to plan," I said. which is different from liking every decision. Wages changed shape too. A universal minimum never arrived, but the floor kept rising through the progressive wage ladders, sector by sector, job by job, paired with co-funding to help firms shoulder fairness without collapsing under it. It was an engineer's compromise in a human problem. Don't just declare a number, wire incentives so that skills, not just sympathy, do the lifting. In parallel, safety nets thickened, insurance that followed you through life, support that kept dignity attached to work, not detoured around it. The second drumbeat came from science and code. The island had flirted with digital for decades, now it demanded a relationship. A phrase with capital letters, Smart Nation, moved from a banner to an install log. Lampposts learned to talk quietly. Drains learned to confess when they were about to flood. A trade data backbone let containers carry paperwork as lightly as they carried goods. Permits that once required standing at counters turned into midnight tasks you could complete at a kitchen table the same night you learned your child's school portal password. It wasn't glamour. It was plumbing. But plumbing is destiny in a city that sells reliability. Did tech make people nervous? He asked. Good tech should, I said. So the island taught itself a new reflex. Ask before you assume, explain before you deploy, protect on purpose. Trust is not an app, it's a policy with manners. Then the world caught a fever and taught everyone new verbs: swab, isolate, trace, vaccinate. The city that treats time as a resource suddenly had to treat closeness as a lie.
Offices went dark. Hawker centers learned the heartbreak of empty lunch hours. Buses ran on schedule for essential riders who looked both proud and exhausted. A small device on keychains and phones became a passport of sorts. Masks became courtesy as much as rule.
And slowly the curve that once climbed without shame learned to flatten. Routine, I said. The routine of discipline. Daily briefings that used numbers like verbs. Quarantine rules that made sense and changed quickly when sense changed. Vaccination drives that treated convenience as the first dose, close, clear, and fast. Support packages that arrived before businesses died. And when the doors opened again, carefully, the city remembered how to be crowded without becoming careless. When the world's arteries unclogged, the island had choices to make. Supply chains wanted resilience more than ever. The city's offer hardened into something more than a handshake. Factories with brains rather than brawn, labs with loading docks, logistics that could see around corners. Semiconductors, biomedical science, advanced chemicals, precision engineering, none of them new, all of them deepened. Headquarter towers resumed their hum, but so did clean rooms where air has to earn its way in. The port shifted its weight to a new shore, bigger and more automated, cranes gliding like patient herons under software that thinks in stacks and tides. The airport rehearsed the future in full daylight. Contactless where it could be, human where it mattered, a fifth terminal sketched with the memory of a pandemic written into its bones. The rail map kept reaching, distances that used to be 1 hour by bus turned into 20 minutes by train, Carlight moved from sermon to street plan. Money changed its tone. Global rules about taxes tightened, incentives matured. The island adjusted without drama, less about discounts, more about certainty, less about being cheap, more about being worth it. A visa for rare talent appeared with a name that waved a passport at the world. A points system arrived to make job passes transparent. The message was impolitely precise. If you can lift the average, there's a place for you. If not, we will still be kind, but we will be clear. Isn't that cold? The boy asked. Cold like a blueprint, I said. Warmth belongs in how people treat one another on trains, at counters, in clinics. Policy has to hold shape. Climate shifted from chapter to table of contents.
The sea thought aloud about the future. Storms rehearsed harder. Afternoons pressed down like a hand. The island's response was stubborn and detailed: a tax on carbon that stopped being a token, plans for power that stretched wires to neighbors and coaxed electrons from new places, solar where it fit, shade where it worked, pumps at the coast and parks in the heart, a long, low project to make flood a word for drains rather than living rooms,
Even the trees went to school, chosen for height, leaf, and the kind of shade that cools pavements, not just nostalgia. It is logistics, and logistics is what the island understands. Population aged in place. Birth rates shrugged. The social compact tilted toward care, clinics trying prevention first, subsidies that made better sooner cheaper than worse later, support for caregivers whose heroism the economy had pretended was a hobby, packages for seniors arrived named with affection rather than bureaucracy, the country does sentiment like someone who never forgot a loan. And when the public square argued, as it should, about fairness and identity, the state learned to listen longer without leaving its post. Always, I said. Crowded trains that needed years to unlearn bad habits. Contract workers who cleaned and built the city but felt the city didn't see them. A culture of competition that sometimes mistook relentless for meaningful. The cure wasn't to stop being demanding. It was to widen what we demanded: kindness in cues, respect for invisible work, a national habit of asking, who pays the price for this convenience? The island looked outward with its usual unromantic curiosity.
De-risking became an industry. The reply from this small place was neither naivete nor fatalism: be useful to many, beholden to none, sell neutrality as a service, make law, not noise.
Arbitration, green finance, cybersecurity, trade data, narrow disciplines that a world in argument needs. In a region still hungry, the island offered two things it has hoarded for 60 years: predictability and time that runs in straight lines. And the arts? The boy said, refusing to let me pretend the city is a spreadsheet. Buskers with permits and confidence, I said. Festivals that close streets the way religion does, without religion. Museums that argue with the syllabus and win. Conservatories that export music the way the port exports containers. Fiction that puts capitiums into the global imagination. Film that reminds policy it has a heart. Beauty doesn't build bridges here, it builds the people who build bridges. He laughed. Give me the pictures. I nodded. A lift lobby at dawn where a home care nurse meets an elderly man and asks about the soccer game first because health is also joy. A clean room where a technician from a vocational school teaches a new engineer from a famous university how to listen to a machine with fingers instead of software, and both go home a little larger. An immigration officer who welcomes a coder with a visa that took weeks to assemble and says, here's how to find the best laksa near your place, because integration begins with lunch. A town council crew that installs larger, shadier trees along a block where afternoons used to feel like punishment, and a child who learns the names of the species the way previous generations learned bus routes, a union leader who argues for a wage floor and a productivity plan in the same breath, and a CEO who realizes the first makes the second possible because turnover stops eating training alive. A teacher who tells a class that failing a test is data, not destiny, and a student who believes her because the school has ladders, not traps. A hawker who refuses to sell a celebrity influencer a secret recipe and instead writes the apprentice's name on the stall's menu board, his own form of succession plan. A seawall that looks like a park until you learn its math, and a jogger who tells a visiting friend it's beautiful, then clarifies, and it works. And the answer, the boy said, why is Singapore so rich? Because it treats wealth as a system, not a score, I said. Because it keeps choosing clarity over charisma. Because it believes that clean is faster and faster is fairer. Because it builds redundancies where others build excuses. Because it remembers that ports are promises, airports are promises, laws are promises, and it keeps them.
He watched a plane arc overhead and bank toward a runway as if tracing the edge of an invisible bowl. Somewhere behind us, a train arrived exactly when it said it would. Somewhere in front of us, a container ship made a turn it had rehearsed 1,000 times. There were problems to solve, there always are in cities that intend to live. But the island, small and noisy and intent, had kept its central vow to make tomorrow slightly easier to plan than yesterday. We walked along the water until the path curled toward trees. The boy slid his phone into his pocket without checking it and matched my pace. The light softened. A ferry shouldered through a channel where the currents run older than any policy. "So, is that the end?" he asked. "It's the end of a chapter," I said. "In 10 years, the answers will rhyme but not repeat. The city will choose again about energy, about talent, about what to forgive and what to forbid. It will make mistakes and correct them in public. That's the work. Rich isn't money, rich is the ability to change without breaking." He nodded, as if filing it alongside every scene we'd collected. The bay breathed. The future, never promised, always prepared for, felt less like a mystery than a schedule the island intended to keep.